Welcome back to KU Pulse, the podcast from Khalifa University. I'm your host, Jade Sterling, joined today by Anousha Khan, here to talk to us about eco-inflation and resource scarcity. So Anousha, welcome.
Thank you for having me. So super excited to be here.
We hear an awful lot about this whole drive towards net zero and businesses becoming more efficient, sustainable, effective in promoting those goals towards a better society, all the rest of it that comes with net zero. It cannot be as simple as just switching off the fossil fuel supply chain. There's got to be more to it. And I suppose that's where the whole eco-inflation thing comes from. So can you start by explaining and defining that term and also where the whole resource scarcity thing comes in?
So traditional inflation is normally caused by disruptions in the supply chain, economic policies, or geopolitics. What we're currently seeing is that eco-inflation is a new rise of inflation that's caused specifically due to environmental disruptions. This might be due to biodiversity loss. This might be due to environmental regulations that are still evolving. This might be due to catastrophic environmental events that are taking place across the globe. I think the interesting thing about corporations that are now facing this issue of eco-inflation is that it's not necessarily something that was incorporated into their business strategy. So as a result of these now evolving climate situations, we're seeing a lot of corporations implement ESG considerations into their risk management approach and also tying in climate risk with their financial risks.
It's kind of an afterthought for them though, isn't it? I mean, what business sets out worrying more about the environment and less about, their financial books?
Yeah, so I think that's always been the case traditionally. A lot of corporations have just looked into the financial aspects of their business, and that's been at the forefront. But the great thing is that that's quickly evolving. It's sad why it's evolving because of these climate risks that were unprecedented. But I think it's really important for corporations to incorporate a lot of ESG considerations into their financial models as well. And I think even from a risk management standpoint, that's great practice. So I think seeing that being implemented at a large scale, whether that's due to compliance or because of the shifting dynamics that we're seeing also from consumers, is a great shift in that consumption economics that we've traditionally seen.
I want to touch back on the public side of things, because I think that the concept of greenwashing is something that we should probably discuss in a bit. But in terms of the eco-inflation, I'm assuming part of that is also to do with the fact that resources are becoming more and more scarce. There's more competition for them, and businesses have to take that into account.
Yeah, I think that's something that is not necessarily unprecedented because we have seen that risk manifest across for decades now. I think corporations are becoming a lot more aware of it now, though. So I think one of the most important implications in that has been the eco-inflation that we've seen, whether that's across food security or even energy. We have very high energy demands that are not being met, and we're looking at a lot of supply chain constraints and issues that are currently in place. And I think having the landscape evolve so quickly has put a lot of corporations kind of in trouble in trying to meet those demands. So I think having policies that are reflecting this evolving landscape is really important. I think a lot of companies have woken up to this rise in eco-inflation and are accordingly putting policies into place that might make sure that that doesn't happen. So that's been a great shift.
If I can kind of give, from what I understand, if would an example then maybe be the AI industry? I think a report came out that if you use ChatGPT to ask a question, it uses 8 times more water than if you simply Google it. I'm pretty sure that's what I read. And so therefore that drives, if more water is being used in one area, that drives up the cost of it for other businesses. You still need to supply that water. Everyone's still got the same requirements, but it's suddenly more expensive, and businesses need to take that into account. And from what it sounds, you're saying that policymakers also need to be aware that this is happening, and they need to be kind of on the ball in managing it.
Yeah, I think policymakers here regionally and locally have made tremendous effort in addressing that. I think we've seen some great policies come out specifically to address these shifts in climate change and the environmental factors that we're working with. I think policymakers, like I said, make a big difference in this field, and we've seen some incredible policies coming into play, not just in terms of mandatory disclosures on scope 1 and 2 emissions, but we're also seeing now penalties for non-disclosure, which is not something that we had seen in the past. So I think there's definitely that push from the top down to incorporate these implications or these considerations into the management of companies. But I've also seen working in the industry that a lot of corporations are not just conforming to local or regional regulations, but a lot of corporations are seeing this growing demand for ESG linked disclosures and implications or considerations that now they're even looking to conform to voluntary disclosures that might not be mandatory. We see this a lot trickling down from some of the more mature ESG frameworks in Europe, where they've made some great strides in that field. And then that kind of trickles down to what we're seeing regionally. And a lot of corporations also operate globally or regionally or across countries. So due to that, I think there's definitely been this great shift in reporting and disclosures, and I think we need to see more of that.
And that I think does tie into the greenwashing aspect in terms of the voluntary efforts that different businesses are making. It does sometimes seem that the larger corporations do a lot of talking. They talk the talk, they don't necessarily walk the walk. So it is encouraging to hear that some of them are actually voluntarily making greater strides.
Yeah, I think even in terms of the voluntary disclosures that we've now seen, it's important to be compliant in a way that is authentic and accurate while also being transparent. One of the great things I think we've seen from the new climate law that has come out is that it also makes third-party verification a part of that strategy. And I think that is very important because we do see a lot of corporations greenwashing and overpromising, and we see this across industries as well, unfortunately. So we see that in fast fashion, we see that in energy, we see that in manufacturing. So I think having that check and balance from the top down is really important. So I think policymakers are definitely making a big difference here.
You mentioned food scarcity, food availability. Can you tell me more about that? How does that play into traditional business?
So food security is something that I think a lot of people aren't aware might become a very daunting risk for the future. I myself recently was a victim to this because I like to have oats in the morning and I usually like to use cocoa powder for that. However, recently I wasn't able to find any cocoa powder because there was a cocoa shortage. And then eventually when I was able to find it, I was also the victim of eco-inflation. So prices are higher. You can't really find the sources that you're looking for. And this is also because of supply chain disruptions. We're seeing a lot of biodiversity loss due to economic policies or the push for quote unquote growth, which is now putting us kind of in a situation where we're cutting down a lot of trees. We're looking at a lot of biodiversity loss in the Amazon as well. And that's kind of led to this cocoa shortage. I read a statistic that, our children are not going to enjoy chocolate as much as we did because it might become very expensive to do so. So as a result of that, we're seeing these trends in food security come across our day to day. And so I think it's very important to be aware of how we can tackle this issue. It's not just about regenerative policies or circular economy. We also have to be looking at responsible consumption. And that's something I think it's really important to advocate for because we do have very high consumption of, different resources here. And I think in order to effectively address resource scarcity, we need to have that top-down approach, but then also bottom-up. And so I think as consumers as well, we have to be very mindful about how we're consuming these products.
I mean, I totally get you. Like, I couldn't find cocoa for a while. I just assumed there was some supply chain issue because, things are still trying to recover after everything that went on pandemic-wise and all the rest of it. There's constant disruptions. And it's just something that you kind of get used to, especially because, like, I am a big chocolate fan. I will absolutely admit to that.
Me too.
But it's not, I don't need it to survive. Do you know what I mean? It's
right.
the kind of thing that you can go, okay, fine, I can't get cocoa. It's not the end of the world. It'll be fine. But what you were saying about all of these efforts that need to be done in order to provide that ingredient to people is creating a bit of a feedback loop because the more trees you cut down, the more carbon you get in the atmosphere, the less is being reabsorbed. It's creating a larger issue that then just kicks the can further down the road.
Yeah, I think cocoa powder is unfortunately just the beginning. I think, for us regionally, we live in a desert climate. We have water scarcity as well. That's something that I think is a much more looming problem that we need to be more creative about. I think what we need to be looking at currently is more innovative solutions. We need to be looking at responsible consumption. We need to kind of move from this linear extractive process of business, but then also consumption, into more regenerative and circular economy principles. I think one of the ways that we can do that is monitoring some of the production cycles, and then also some of the consumption cycles, and seeing where can we improve on this. I think we need to be more mindful about our meat consumption. I think that's something that's very important as well. We see a lot of factory farming that takes place. We see a lot of greenhouse gases that are being produced specifically from the red meat industry. So I'm not telling people not to eat red meat or anything. I also enjoy red meat, but I think we definitely need to be a bit more mindful about our consumption.
So this eco-inflation, you mentioned that everything is now more expensive when it does come back into the supply chain. I'm hesitant to ask, but is this kind of our new normal? Is this where things are going as we try and do better? Does that... It feels a little bit like it might be a little bit worse for the people on the ground.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do think this might be the new normal, at least for the short to medium term. I think we can definitely see it improving down the line. I think we can expect some stabilization to take place once we've kind of gotten a hang of it. I think it's a multifaceted problem, which requires a multifaceted solution. So we have talked about policymaking, which I think is really important. We've talked about the consumer trends that we need to be looking at. We need to also look into technological advancement, because we do need innovative, resource efficient technology in order to, look at the rising demand for energy production. I mean, like you mentioned about AI, we use so much energy for the data centers that are required for that. So in order to meet these growing demands for energy, we also need to look at deploying green infrastructure, both in the developed world and the developing world. I think that these rising costs might be a bit of a deterrence to developing nations, which are looking towards, let's say, solar energy, which is relatively efficient. But we need to be making that push towards more resource efficiency, whether that's through solar, whether that's through green hydrogen, whether that's through most of the green technology that we currently have. So I think that's a very important step to consider as well.
I think multifaceted, absolutely. But I want to use the word that you did, which is daunting. This is a huge problem that's going to require almost everybody to kind of get behind it, from the consumers to business owners to people actually working in the businesses to policymakers to everybody along the whole loop. It's... And it sounds great being like, these are the things we can do, this is what needs to happen. But how do we do this? How do we get there?
I think the most important thing, or the most important aspect here, is having a structured approach. I think we need different entities or different levels of society to be involved to the best of their abilities. I don't think we can put the onus entirely, let's say, on companies or just consumers. We need to be held, or we need to be accountable for our own role in this, because at the end of the day, climate change is not going to discriminate. No. And I was even reading that in the future, we're expecting climate refugees to be one of the most prevalent form of refugees. And these are going to be people that have to flee their homes, their countries, in order to escape the catastrophic climate events that might take place. For us here regionally, we're at risk of flooding because we're, in terms of the sea levels and things like that. So we have to be very proactive in how we choose to engage with this. And I think having conversations like this are very important, so that we have that awareness and we can kind of make that shift. Like I said, from a linear model to more circular economy, we need to be looking at recycling. We need to be looking at reusing. We need to be looking at consumption patterns and things of that sort, in order to bring that down, not just regionally or locally, but also globally.
I think there's a temptation with these kind of discussions to just kind of just talk around it. Do you know, it's like, yeah, this is a problem. I accept global warming is an issue. Of course it is. We have scientific fact to back that up. But it's happening over there. It's not happening here. And I do sometimes think that certainly the floods that we've seen in the States over the past couple of weeks, New York flooded recently. Yeah. These are places that you wouldn't usually assume are going to be victim of that. So yeah, absolutely. It doesn't discriminate, and everybody has that responsibility to recognize things that are happening across the globe if we want to have supply chains that are globalized. So let's talk a little bit more about policy in terms of what can be done there. I'm assuming there must be some kind of financial incentives that can be put in place to help businesses drive these changes.
Yeah, I think in terms of economic incentives, we're looking at a bit of a deterrence in terms of being penalized if you don't conform. I think that's always one way to go about it, which is something that we've seen. There's going to be fines if companies choose not to conform or disclose their emissions. So that's, I think, risk management. You can look at it that way. I think also we're looking at a lot of green financing that is taking place currently. We're looking at that being deployed in the developing world, but then also regionally, the government is really pushing for solar energy. We're looking now at green hydrogen that's being researched extensively. We're looking at incentives in implementing that.
So, in the sense that it would be like subsidized energy.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's some patterns that we can definitely look into. I think the banks are now offering green financing options. So corporations that are looking to get ESG-linked loans have lower interest rates. So there is definitely that financial incentive. I think at this stage, it's become more strategic as well, because if there was to be a climate event that would result in major financial loss, it makes sense for corporations to get ahead of that and then look into the climate risk that would be associated with a certain climate event and then plan ahead so that they don't suffer from financial losses. So there's many elements of that at play. I think, we're seeing a lot of push from the consumer side as well to have products that are more economically friendly or environmentally friendly, and eco-conscious. We're looking at supply chains. We're looking at ethical labor practices and sustainably sourced materials or products. And that push is definitely coming from the consumer. And in terms of corporations, I mean, they're trying to make money. Yeah. So they definitely will listen to the consumer if there is that shift in priorities. And we're seeing that, like, a lot of consumers are willing to pay a premium on environmentally friendly products. I do that. I'm sure a lot of people do that. So I think that financial incentive is definitely there for corporations to act.
Part of sustainability, though, is the very definition of the word is long lasting. So is this a kind of zeitgeisty thing where we're saying, oh, climate change is here, it's real, we need to make these changes, I'm going to buy products that are better for the planet. Can we expect that to last and have a lasting impact on business development, if you're trying to build your own business now, you have to take that into consideration now. But is that going to be the case 10, 15, 20 years down the line, when we need to be building this long-lasting concept?
I think there's a couple of different elements to that we need to look into. I think for energy deployment, we definitely need renewable systems that are more efficient and economically viable. I mean, fossil fuels are, just so accessible, which is why a lot of people we have that trend that is focused towards fossil fuels. I worked previously in plastic alternative manufacturing. So we were kind of looking at how we can create alternatives to plastic, which are not bad for the environment or don't take so long to biodegrade. And it's definitely possible. Like, that's something that we've seen. There's a lot of material science that goes into it, but we've seen that shift towards products that are more environmentally friendly. But then again, there is that cost that's associated with it, right? Plastic, for example, is just so cheap to come by. Like, it's a byproduct of oil production. We're in an oil economy. It makes sense to have that in place. But there's definitely that premium. And I think there's always going to be that debate whether the onus of the premium should be on the corporations doing the manufacturing, whether it should be up to governments to subsidize, whether the consumer should pay for that margin, the profit margin, let's say. I think it's an evolving conversation. I don't have a solution for that, to be honest with you. It's something that we need to be very mindful of, because at the end of the day, I think it's just a matter of this is a collective responsibility. I think everyone needs to be all hands on deck. It's not something that we can just shrug off and say, well, corporations need to make it more accessible or have that price parity, or consumers should be expected to pay for it. I think having a balance between the two would probably be best, but it's hard to say.
Again, it's multifaceted. Like, you were completely right with that. There is so much going on that it can't just be down to one person. But I am going to ask you, if you had the magic wand and you had total control over everything, you could do whatever you want, what would you do to expedite this?
Probably not have corporations looking into their economic benefit or have that influence over policy or the various aspects of this, because I think what ends up happening is that because these corporations are so important to the economy, we have a lot of these pressures exerted by large corporations in order to meet energy demands. Like we need energy, right? Whether it's from fossil fuels or not, we can't live without energy. So I guess having everything be in perspective and not having, personal business motivation be a part of that process would be great. But,
yeah, that's a huge point. Yeah, the sway that these businesses can have over policy is something that can't be underestimated. Absolutely.
I think in some cases they even have more power than most governments, which is
that's a scary thing to consider, though.
We have a lot of really large corporations that have more sway than plenty of governments.
And I mean, I don't know if we can even keep this in, but I feel like it's a good point. You've got corporations like Amazon, who are completely globally prevalent. Is there a country that doesn't have Amazon? And
Amazon can cause a lot of supply chain disruptions because
absolutely.
we're so reliant on them.
Yeah, and they could literally do that if their policy is being floated that they don't agree with, and that is it's a concern. It feeds into the idea of I am a consumer. I'm told not to use plastic bags because the turtles might choke on them. Yeah. But then Amazon is sat there and can just completely disrupt a framework because they're not going to make as much money. Yeah, it's a frightening concept.
Yeah.
But let's talk about these frameworks that policymakers are bringing in. I feel like framework is a bit of an overarching term. What does a framework actually look like in terms of something that you could implement in a business?
So I think the interesting thing about frameworks is that they can definitely adapt to the different industries that we're working with. So the frameworks that we would apply for, let's say, the banking sector is going to be very different to what we would be looking at in terms of manufacturing. So in terms of that, I think it's very important to conduct a materiality assessment and look at the specific risks that are being associated with a specific type of business, whether it's, within the energy sector, whether it's metals or mining, which is going to be very different than, let's say, a financial corporation. So once we've kind of identified those risks, it's very important to communicate that effectively to stakeholders. We need to have that conversation with them and make them very well aware in advance of these are the risks that are associated with your business, and these can potentially turn into financial risks. And that's usually when the conversation gets really interesting. And then I think it's really important to apply that to the specific modalities of that business and have a risk management approach well in advance before any catastrophic event is going to take place. Once we have that, it's just a matter of being prepared. I think no one can predict these things, right? We can't say what will or will not happen, but I think having a contingency plan for a corporation is something that's becoming increasingly important. I think a lot of companies have definitely seen some financial loss. I have worked with corporations where there's been disruptions in supply chain, where there's been, issues in labor management as well. That's a very important topic for the manufacturing industry or infrastructure. So in terms of that, we need to be very holistic in our approach in identifying these gaps within their current strategy and where they're supposed to be. A lot of ESG frameworks are, like you said, overarching and generic. It's also important for us to look at science-based targets, to look at more specific frameworks that pertain to that specific industry, and then create a strategy that aligns with the company's goals and then also within their specific industry.
This is your day-to-day. This is your job. This is your entire world. Are you positive that we can actually make a difference?
I am positive. I've seen a lot of corporations take the risks, the material risks that they're facing and look at policy making and looking at different material aspects of their business to see how they can incorporate these aspects of climate change and social causes and governance into their business management strategy. Do I think that the corporations are perfect? No, I don't. However, I do think that there's definitely that push and that awareness that we didn't have, let's say, 10 years ago, but we do have it now in place. I think a lot of corporations are now willing to make that investment towards being more safeguarded because of environmental events that might take place, because of biodiversity loss. A lot of businesses might be impacted because of that. We're looking at more sustainably sourced materials and products that are being produced as a result of that. So I am optimistic. I think there can always be more of a push from policymakers from the top down, because at the end of the day, it does become a legislation, regulatory compliance issue. So I think the mechanism by which we attain the results that we're looking for varies. Sometimes, we see consumer-centric corporations, and then sometimes it is definitely just a compliance thing for them. So I think having those conversations with key stakeholders is something that's very important. That's what we try to do. I think you can go a long way by having some of these more difficult conversations and helping stakeholders understand that this is not just a risk for the environment, and it's not just an ethical issue, but then also something that is going to be strategic in the long term.
Well, this was awesome. Thank you so much for the work that you do and for coming in today to speak to us.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time chatting with you.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you'd like to learn more about this and other topics, please feel free to check out all other episodes of KU Pulse and subscribe and follow us. You can find us on YouTube, SoundCloud, and Spotify.